In this video, we'll be reviewing the most essential punctuation marks in English. We'll cover periods, commas, semicolons, colons, apostrophes, quotation marks, question marks, exclamation marks, parentheses, and brackets. As we can see, there's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. We start with periods. Periods signal the end of a complete sentence, like, she sells ice cream, period. As a quick reminder, a complete sentence includes a subject, a predicate, and expresses a complete thought. For a more in-depth review, check out our core sentence construction video. Using a period to complete a sentence before all three of these needs are met results in a sentence fragment. For example, went to the store has no subject, I to the store has no predicate, and I went to the doesn't express a complete thought. For a more in-depth review of fragments, check out our Common Sentence Structure Errors video. Next, we have commas. While essentially used to indicate a pause in the sentence and group the words together logically, commas have more jobs than any other punctuation mark. We'll outline the 5 main jobs of a comma and one common comma mistake. Number 1. Separating items in a list. This is one of the most common and familiar uses of a comma. When you're listing 3 or more items, you separate them with commas. For example, I bought apples, comma, bananas, comma, and oranges. That final comma before and is known as the Oxford comma or serial comma. Some styles leave it out, but using it often makes your writing clearer, especially when the list is more complex. But it's equally fine to write I bought apples, bananas, and oranges without the Oxford comma before the and. Either way is fine as long as you're consistent. Number 2. After an introductory word, phrase, or clause. Introductory elements often tell us when, where, how, or why something in the sentence is happening, or they may simply provide context, tone, or the speaker's perspective before the main part of the sentence begins. When a sentence begins with an introductory element, use a comma to set it off from the main part of the sentence. For example, after the meeting, comma, we went out for lunch. After the meeting tells us when the action in this sentence, going out for lunch, is happening, and therefore it needs to be separated from the main clause by a comma. Other examples include, trying to get a better view, the girl used binoculars, and, to be honest, I didn't expect that response. Trying to get a better view tells us why the girl is using binoculars, and, to be honest, tells us the perspective of the speaker. Number 3. Before coordinating conjunctions that join independent clauses. When 2 complete sentences, each containing a subject, predicate, and expressing a complete thought, are joined by a coordinating conjunction like and, but, or, so, yet, or for, a comma is used before the conjunction. For example, he wanted to stay, but he had to leave. Here, both he wanted to stay and he had to leave are complete sentences. Therefore, when joining them, we need to place a comma before the coordinating conjunction. For a more in-depth review of coordinating conjunctions, check out our video on clause types and conjunctions. Other examples include, I studied all night, so I did well on the test, and he was allergic to cats, yet he owned 2. Again, I studied all night and I did well on the test are full sentences and are therefore separated with a comma and conjunction. Likewise, he was allergic to cats and he owned 2 are both full sentences, so we see a comma and conjunction joining them. However, we don't use a comma if what follows isn't an independent clause, meaning it can't stand alone as a full sentence. In the sentence, he enjoys playing soccer and watching movies, there's no comma, as while he enjoys playing soccer is a full sentence, watching movies is not. Number 4. Setting off non-essential information. When a part of the sentence adds extra detail that isn't necessary to identifying the subject, we use commas to set it apart. For example, my brother, who loves sushi, is coming to visit. The phrase, who loves sushi, gives us extra detail about the brother, but the sentence would still be complete without it. My brother is coming to visit. On the other hand, if the information is essential, meaning we wouldn't be able to properly identify the subject without it, don't use commas. For example, students who study regularly tend to perform better. We don't use commas to separate who study regularly, as this is essential to identifying the students. We're not simply discussing students in general, but specifically students who study regularly. And number 5, separating adjectives that describe the same noun. When we have 2 or more adjectives that independently describe the same noun, we separate them with a comma. For example, it was a long, exhausting day. In this example, the day is being described as both long and exhausting, and therefore we need a comma between them. A good test to see if the comma is necessary is if you could either add the word and between the adjectives or reverse the order of the adjectives. In this case, we could say, it was a long and exhausting day, or it was an exhausting long day, and it would still be grammatically correct. On the other hand, in the sentence, she wore a bright red dress, although bright and red are both adjectives, they're not both describing the dress. Red describes the dress, while bright describes the shade of red. Therefore, in this case, we don't add a comma. And our test confirms this. It wouldn't sound right to say, she wore a red, bright dress, or she wore a bright and red dress. And finally, a common comma mistake. A common mistake made with commas is the comma splice. A comma splice happens when 2 independent clauses are joined with just a comma and no conjunction. For example, she went to the store, comma, I cooked dinner. These are both independent clauses and need something stronger than a comma to separate them. To correct this, we'd either need to separate these 2 clauses into 2 entirely different sentences, or add a comma and conjunction. For example, she went to the store and I cooked dinner. For a more in-depth look at comma splices, check out our video on common sentence structure errors. Next, we have semicolons. A semicolon's main job is to separate 2 closely connected independent clauses. That is, 2 clauses that can stand on their own as complete sentences. Take, for example, these 2 clauses. I invited Natalie to the party. I love hanging out with her. These clauses are connected, as one could surmise that the reason the speaker invited Natalie to the party is because they like spending time with her. Therefore, a perfectly acceptable way to connect these 2 clauses would be with a semicolon. I invited Natalie to the party, semicolon, I love hanging out with her. When we have 2 unrelated clauses, say, it was raining yesterday, my dog needs to visit the vet, while grammatically we can technically connect them with a semicolon, it doesn't make as much sense, as there's no inherent connection here. In this case, it would be better to keep them separated as 2 entirely different sentences. Something to be wary of is making sure your semicolons are connecting 2 independent clauses, and not an independent clause and a fragment. Take the sentence, there are many ways to prepare eggs, for example, scrambled. While there are many ways to prepare eggs is an independent clause, for example, scrambled is not. Therefore, it wouldn't be acceptable to separate these 2 clauses with a semicolon. Another job of the semicolon is to separate items in a list when those items include commas themselves. Let's explain with an example. I have traveled to Copenhagen, Denmark, Florence, Italy, and Dublin, Ireland. Each of these places correctly includes a comma between the city and country name. However, when we also use a comma to separate these destinations, it becomes hard to tell where one entry ends and the other begins. Therefore, in this instance, we would use semicolons to separate these entries. I have traveled to Copenhagen, Denmark, semicolon, Florence, Italy, semicolon, and Dublin, Ireland. Another example would be, she met up with her older brother, Edward, her closest friend, and her classmate. In this case, only the first entry, her older brother, Edward, has a comma, but we continue using semicolons throughout the rest of the sentence for consistency. Next, we have colons. Colons are most commonly used to introduce information that explains, lists, or emphasizes what came before it. Let's give an example of each. An example of introducing an explanation would be, that's my dream car, fast and sleek. The information following the colon, fast and sleek, explains why that car is the speaker's dream car. An example of a colon introducing a list would be, her desk was cluttered with objects, papers, pens, and coffee mugs. Here, the colon introduces a list of exactly what objects are cluttering her desk. And finally, an example of a colon being used for emphasis would be, only one word came to mind upon seeing the painting: incredible. The colon here lets the reader pause in order to give the word incredible the full effect. It's important to note that we don't use a colon directly after a verb or preposition that leads into a list. For example, we don't say, my favorite fruits are, apples, kiwis, and grapes. In this case, we'd remove the colon entirely, giving us, my favorite fruits are apples, kiwis, and grapes. Next, we have apostrophes. Apostrophes have two main jobs. 1, to indicate possession, and 2, to mark a missing letter in a contraction. Let's focus on each of these one at a time. In the phrase, this is George's house, the apostrophe S after George indicates possession. It shows us that the house belongs to George. To simply write, this is George's house without an apostrophe is incorrect. In any context of possession, an apostrophe is necessary. But what if the house belongs to someone whose name already ends with an S? Chris, for example. In this case, it's grammatically acceptable to either add an apostrophe after the S, or to simply add an apostrophe without another S at the end. Both are grammatically acceptable. The important thing is consistency. Pick one method and stick with it. The one exception to this rule is the word its. When referring to something that belongs to an it, for example, the seats are its best feature, we never use an apostrophe. We leave it simply as its. The reason for this is that it''s is a contraction of it is, which brings us to our next apostrophe function. Many words in English are contractions, that is, either a shortened version of a word or two words put together, resulting in at least one missing letter. Can't, for example, is a contraction of cannot. There is they are, she'll is she will, etc. In each case, we use an apostrophe to mark where the missing letters should be. Its is a contraction of it is, with the apostrophe marking where the I of is should have been. This being the case, we don't mark the it possessive with an apostrophe, but this is the only exception. Next, we have quotation marks. Quotation marks are used to show dialogue or quote exact language. When reading a book, anything a character says will be found in quotation marks. For example, I can't believe you just said that, she cried. All my work was for nothing? Notice that in American English, all punctuation marks, including periods and commas, stay inside the quotation marks. Quotation marks are also used when quoting exact language. For example, you might read in the newspaper, according to the CEO, business is, quote, recovering slowly but surely from the economic blow, end quote. Next, we have question marks. Just as it sounds, question marks go at the end of questions. For example, is Natalie coming to school? Why did he get a cat? How long ago did Caesar live? Note that when we have an indirect question, or framing a question someone else asked, we don't use a question mark. For example, she asked when he would get here. Although the direct question, when will he get here, requires a question mark, the indirect question does not. Another thing to note is that sentences beginning with I wonder don't receive question marks. Although something like I wonder who will get the lead role might sound like a question, grammatically it's considered a statement and does not receive a question mark. Next, we have exclamation points. Also known as exclamation marks, these show strong emotion or emphasis. For example, that's amazing, I hate you, or watch out. In formal writing, these should rarely, if ever, be used, and even in more relaxed settings, use only one at a time, and sparingly. If you're constantly shouting at your audience, it quickly loses effect. Next, we have parentheses. Parentheses are used to enclose extra information, details that clarify, explain, or add context, but aren't essential to the main sentence. For example, she finally answered after what felt like hours and said yes. As a rule, you must be able to remove what's in the parentheses and have the sentence still make grammatical sense. In this sentence, if we remove what's in the parentheses, we're left with, she finally answered and said yes, which is perfectly acceptable from a grammatical perspective. Parentheses can also be used to define abbreviations or acronyms. For example, he works for the World Health Organization, parentheses WHO. If there's a need for an entire sentence to be in parentheses, the period stays inside the parentheses. For example, in 2002, the charity helped rehome 412 dogs. Since then, that number has risen to 4,566. Another thing to take into account when using parentheses is that when focusing on subject-verb agreement, we don't take into account anything written in parentheses. Take, for example, the sentence, "The principal and all the teachers need to attend the conference." In this context, the subject is the principal and all the teachers, meaning the subject is plural, and we use the plural verb need instead of the singular needs. However, if we were to put "and all the teachers" in parentheses, our subject is now only the principal, a singular subject, as we don't take what's written in the parentheses into account. Therefore, we'd need to write "the principal and all the teachers needs" in the singular to attend the conference. And lastly, we have brackets. Brackets' most common use is to insert something into a quotation that wasn't originally there. For example, she said, "It happened when I was in my freshman year of college." Here, the words "my freshman year of" weren't in the original quote, but they do help clarify it by telling us exactly when in her college career this event happened. The brackets show that the writer added it for clarification, but it wasn't mentioned in the original quote. Another example is, "The project is much more complicated than I was expecting. It is exhausting." If someone wants to quote only the second sentence, "it is exhausting," they might put "the project" in brackets to give us more context as to what they're talking about. You'll also see brackets used to change verb tense or explain who a pronoun is referring to. For example, she said that she does not agree with the final decision. In the original quote, the speaker would have said, "I do not agree with the final decision." Because in our quote we refer to her as she and not I, it's necessary to change the do to does in this context. Because that's not exactly what the speaker originally said, we put it in brackets. Another example would be, "The defendant claims he was out of town at the time." Here, the original speaker may have said, "He claims he was out of town at the time," but the writer added "the defendant" to make the subject clearer to the reader. Another use of brackets is to indicate errors or unusual grammar in quoted text. In that case, you might see "sick" written inside the brackets, showing that the error was in the original and hasn't been corrected. For example, "I were sick late to the meeting." Of course, "I were" is incorrect, and the sentence should say "I was." The usage of "sick" in brackets shows us that the writer is indicating he's aware of the mistake but wants to record the text as accurately as possible. Another example would be, "We have received your letter." Here, the author wants to make it clear that "received" has been spelled incorrectly, with an I before the E instead of the other way around. But again, he wants to maintain the authenticity of the original quote. And that wraps up our overview of punctuation. We've gone over periods, commas, semicolons, colons, apostrophes, quotation marks, question marks, exclamation marks, parentheses, and brackets, their common uses, and highlighted a few mistakes to avoid. Again, we've covered a lot, so make sure to review this material going forward. Make sure to also watch the other videos in the series for a full review and keep practicing.